right, welcome back to the CPAC members and to the folks watching online. Just want to chime in with Kat's chat. If you guys can make sure that you're logged into the voting software as we start to go forward for the voting questions. And I'm not going to check to see if everybody's back, but good for you guys. And as I'm looking through, it looks like just about all the voting members of CPAC are now back in their chairs, so to speak. So, okay, so let's go through the voting questions, and we're going to dive back into some of the issues that you raised in the good discussion earlier this morning. And again, just to remind everybody, we have the community experts and the clinical experts available to us as we go through this phase of the meeting as well. So the next slide. All right, so the first voting question will be, given the currently available evidence, is it adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of SIFs is superior to that provided by SSPs alone? So this is, yes, this is back asking you to compare what hasn't been compared directly in any study, which is SIF versus an SSP by itself. And yes or no. Eric, why don't I at least kick it off by letting you briefly again summarize the evidence on this, and then we'll talk about its strengths and limitations before we have the CPAC take a vote.
So in summary, our assessment of the evidence suggests that a SIF prevents overdose death within the SIF, right? And then also based on the Marshall paper, more broadly in the community, the all-cause mortality, which was discussed and raised as this topic, is a bit uncertain. Although there are studies, and we can point you to those, that are in the report that did explore all-cause mortality. So we would say that it prevents overdose death, it improves injection risk behaviors, even in comparison to an SSP. It reduces the visibility of drug use. It has no apparent impact on crime, and it assists clients with accessing medical, mental health, and social support services, including the use of addiction treatment. I think that's our kind of high-level summary of the evidence in this particular case, with the strongest evidence or confidence coming from the mortality reduction benefit.
And Eric, can you just, since these tables are provided in the evidence summary, can you let them know where to look for this?
Yeah, so table 2.2, right, is where we're highlighting the overdose mortality within a SIF, right? That comes from a variety of sources, but basically that no one has reported a death occurring within a SIF in published literature, as well as kind of the gray literature. Then the Marshall study is where we're anchoring the overdose mortality within the community. And that was the one that we covered in the presentation. That's table 2.2. We can also then look at things like infection prevention. Table 2.4 summarizes the effect of a SIF on injection risk behaviors, syringe sharing, HIV risk behaviors, and other risk behaviors. We highlighted in the presentation, we focus mostly on the syringe sharing, but there is other evidence around other injection risk behaviors, such as using clean water, reusing of syringes, injecting in a clean place. And that's not studied, or at least was not covered in we couldn't benchmark that on an SSP.
Okay.
Yep.
And can I just jump in? Because I know one of the things that we're going to want to return back to is the generalizability question. And one of those factors would be where these data come from in time versus what we're facing today as far as the opioid and other crises. So is there a way for you to comment on things like the shift to higher use of fentanyl compared to some of the older data to methamphetamine? And are there other aspects of the generalizability that I'm sure we'll want to continue to talk about, but I just wanted to give you an early chance to say, given when the data was gathered and the setting in which it was gathered, to try to extrapolate that to today in American cities.
Yeah.
What are the major issues that you think either provide confidence or lack of confidence in our ability to extrapolate those results?
Right. So this involves time travel. So I'll tell the CPAC that what you have to do is, back when the Marshall study was was done. The toxicity of drugs, injected drugs, was different, right? Fentanyl was not, let's just say it was not around, at least not to the level that it is today, and has driven overdose mortality, at least in the United States. And so as the risk of overdose and the risk of overdose mortality changes over time, because the toxicity of the drugs and the preferences of people who use drugs change, the value of a CIF becomes greater, right? So our estimates and I think you see this in economic analysis, are based on a certain overdose mortality risk of anyone who comes into a CIF, right? Or anyone generally in the population. And the magnitude of the benefit that we have described, in the report, and at least in the clinical evidence, is based off of studies from 2003, right? When the drug supply was different. And by different, I mean, it was less toxic, right? And so the probability of an overdose would have been lower back then. That's couched, and you have to balance that with other harm reduction interventions that have also been layered in as part of a portfolio of harm reduction strategies, including, most notably, widespread naloxone access, right? Like that has a direct mortality benefit and is known to be effective. And that has also changed in the last 20 years as well. I hope that's a helpful context for you, Steve.
Yeah, and we'll probably come back to other aspects of, is there something special about the fast food joints in Vancouver that make it different than some other, there are all kinds of questions about the generalizability of the context.
Yeah, I mean, today's conversation has focused a lot on evidence from the published, studies, but more recent evidence coming from government-sanctioned or government-sponsored evaluation reports, specifically in Australia, would demonstrate that in Sydney, where they've had a CIF, right, they implemented another one in Melbourne, or a town called North Richmond, and in fact, saw the same results, right? So there's some confidence in replicability, right? There's some confidence I get from the model being replicated and being done so relatively recently, like that is in the last 4 years. Now, that's not a peer-reviewed published study. It comes from an evaluation report. We don't provide the same level of confidence, but we still saw the mortality, the within CIF mortality reduction benefit in that setting as well, from very recent data. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So CPAC members, please use the raise hand function so I can find you if you'd like to ask a question.
I don't know if
Matt,
I'm a CPAC. I did
please.
use my raise hand
Yes,
function.
go ahead.
So this is a great citation that I think you guys should all check out, but it's fentanyl-assisted treatment as a possible role in the overdose epidemic. And there's just one line I want to read to you guys. It's in the conclusion. In conclusion, a range of existing OAT options are effective for some patients, but not all. The increasing availability of illicit fentanyl is changing the treatment equation due to the need to move urgently to pursue strategies to better attract and retain high-risk individuals in OAT. And I feel like that sums it up, right? Like methadone, Suboxone, that was great when it was heroin and prescription pills. But now that we're in a synthetic world, we need to do a lot more. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up more or less to second what Steve, or sorry, whoever just spoke.
Eric, thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, any comments or questions from the CPAC members about this voting question?
So compelling, they don't have any questions.
I guess so. I guess I feel a little bit a duty to be a little bit public about my thinking, because I've already expressed some skepticism about the Marshall paper. I do think there are methodological issues with the Marshall paper. I do think the use of concurrent controls in different neighborhoods. There's also a statistical power issue, a borderline p-value. I mean, I know it's a large effect estimate, and those are issues about efficacy, not only effectiveness, and this issue about translating to different settings. I will say, I think this discussion today has been very helpful to me, and I find arguing back against what I've just said. There is some, the dose response point that David made, I think, was a very important one. Eric's cited some also gray literature from other settings. I mean, a lot of those issues have the same issues with control groups or reference groups, but it's always reassuring to hear that something came up multiple times. And also, I will say, like the community representatives today have been very clear about stigma. This has come up over and over again. And I am sort of persuaded that the standards of evidence that for COVID treatment, say, is not being generated in part because of stigma, right? The grants aren't available to evaluate these sorts of things. So it's important, I think, to take in consideration stigma in our weighing of the evidence, because maybe our normal standards for evidence aren't quite the same because of stigma and inavailability for research in this area. So I sort of came out pretty skeptical, but I also have been persuaded back. I also get the point about the no deaths ever observed in facilities, but there is, of course, this issue that maybe the people who have more access to safe drug use practice are more likely to attend. There's a selection bias issue, but I guess if there's been 0 deaths, the effect is so large that maybe that is persuasive as well. And I would love any feedback about any of this thinking. I think this is a pretty complicated issue.
Peter's using the old-fashioned raised hand approach. I like that. Go ahead.
So I will try and be brief. There's a certain methadone providers want to provide methadone and they want to advocate for such. People who supply syringes for needle exchanges here in Canada, they want to supply syringes. Naloxone suppliers, so everybody's got a piece, everybody wants a piece of this action. And also they don't really necessarily want a piece of any other action. Whereas harm reduction workers, we look at the broad landscape, the whole horizon, because you know what, no one size fits all, okay? But it's important that people who use drugs and people who work with people who use drugs are part of this action, because you know, when we have outside people making the calls, things go awry. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, and we'll come back to that point when we are talking about implementation aspects in the policy roundtable.
And as they, Steve, as they think about that vote, I think that there's a point in Peter's comment, which I think people know, but I will reemphasize, right? Which is, the question isn't phrased, and the research that supports this was not, is a SIF alone the silver bullet to solving this particular problem? The question is, from my mind, and as I approach this particular project, does it belong in the portfolio of harm reduction, right? As one of the complementary, a complementary intervention or a complementary strategy. Like, and obviously in the way that we framed the question, it was like incremental to SSPs, but it fits in the full portfolio.
And you know what, and I think Peter will back me up on this, on the cost effectiveness, right? You got the Insight model, which is very expensive, 1.5 million, however much it costs a year. But you have models like Moss Parks. It's the only site I ever used in, and it's because it's, even though there's a nurse there, she's not in the using room, she's doing her paperwork. It's ran by the community, and I think. And that's when I really started to become open about my drug use, because I never felt so liberated in my life. And those sites are cheaper, they're more effective, and they include people who use drugs, and they're the ones that need to be included the most.
All right. So we're going to talk about that too as we round out things. So we're going to focus on this voting question, and I'm seeing a few other raised hands. So now I'm going to try to be a little bit quick, because I want to make sure we do have time to talk about the broader benefits and contextual issues. But I've got David first.
I just wanted to suggest to Jason and everyone that no matter what, we shouldn't be grading on a curve just because maybe the evidence should have been able to be created and it wasn't. So I do think, as you think about net health benefits and how certain you are, you should judge this the way you would judge anything else. You see where ICER came down on this, but if you think you wouldn't have judged it that way, I personally wouldn't say, well, they had no hope of getting better evidence, and so this is the best they could do. We should be consistent across everything we judge.
David, I appreciate that point. I hope I didn't overemphasize that aspect of, and I would just reiterate, I'm also persuaded by some of the comments you've made about dose responsiveness and reproducibility that Eric's made in Australian data, for example. But I appreciate you making the point. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise in my comment.
All right, thank you. Ed?
So we saw a major effect of reduction in overdose mortality, and there were a lot of secondary kinds of outcomes that looked like they would have affected mortality downstream. I just want to make sure I understood that even though we don't have a better estimate of mortality, we're probably underestimating the magnitude of the effect.
I think, well, that's in the eye of the beholder, but Eric, I think you can comment in terms of all these secondary, if you will, or longer term signals, what the evidence was.
So we have signals, for example, that that people who use a CIF or people who use a CIF frequently have and receive more access to mental health services, right? Like there's some, I don't put a whole lot of confidence in that evidence right now because it's sort of a low use versus high use participant. And we know that there's inherent confounding or bias with that. So we believe that that's true. We also have a theoretical basis in which a CIF operates in a relationship building arrangement with clients in a way that's different than a SSP. Like that's a known attribute of the, of the CIF as well. I think on the area of longer term benefits, I probably think the most about infection prevention, right? So this is HIV, hepatitis, costly, morbidity laden conditions. And the best we have, right, in terms of the comparison is essentially injection behaviors, right, syringe sharing or others. So if you believe that syringe sharing and other injection behaviors or safer injection practices prevent HIV and hepatitis, then I would say I feel pretty good about that. If you want demonstrable evidence on incidence reduction when it comes to a CIF, that's not available at this. I would just say that we were unable to uncover that evidence for you at this particular time. So.
All right. Good. I want to try to manage our time appropriately, and seeing no other raised hands, I think it's been a very good discussion both this morning and later on this voting question. So let's go ahead and vote, and we should have 15 voting responses. So is the evidence adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of CIFs is superior to that provided by SSPs alone? Very good. We can see the results. All right. That's a pretty clear picture. Thank you very much. Good. Let's move to the next set of questions. Okay. So here we move into a different kind of framework of voting. It's not yes or no. It's a 1, 2, or 3 kind of vote, a condensed Likert scale, if you will, about potential other benefits and contextual considerations as they relate to CIF. So I'm going to read them each in its turn, one by one, to vote, and then there will be an other category that we'll spend some time on as well. So go ahead to the next slide, please. Okay, first, 1, 2, or 3, and I'm just going to read them again because 1 in our lexicon means that it somehow would suggest lower relative value to the intervention, and a 3 would suggest higher value within whichever kind of general frame you're thinking of. It would push you lower or higher, with a 2 vote being neutral. So the suggesting lower value would be this intervention will not differentially benefit a historically disadvantaged or underserved community, and 3 is this intervention will differentially benefit a historically disadvantaged or underserved community. Eric already kind of walked through this in his presentation early this morning, but Eric, again, just briefly from the research team's perspective, the view on whether this intervention is or isn't, in a sense, targeted to differentially benefit a historically disadvantaged or underserved community.
Yeah, so the research team believes that this is a intervention that clearly serves and supports a historically disadvantaged and underserved community. I would give it a 3. There are there's a number of pieces of evidence that we cited, in the presentation and in the report that make it very clear, at least to me, that that's what's at play here, and that's who's being supported by this particular intervention. Others today, I think CPAC members have talked very clearly about stigmatization, which is probably contributing to that historical disadvantage. It's not captured in the way that that's said, but I probably would suggest that depending on how you vote on this, that we capture those comments, in the final report.
Okay, why don't we briefly bring up everybody's face again out of this voting question, if we can do that. Okay, would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment before we vote on this one? Kelly, was that you raising your hand? I'm sorry. If yes,
It was, I think, thank you. I think the comment that I would make is, I think it would be good at some time in the future to have some research done about people actually served in a site and the experiences of people based on gender, race, disability, and so on.
Thank you. That's actually a good point. Very good point. Okay, we have other things to vote on, which I think we might have more to wrestle with. So let's go ahead and go back to the voting question. All right, so please go ahead and vote a 1 or a 2 or a 3. 1 would suggest lower value, 3 would suggest higher value based on this factor. Thank you. Okay, 15 number 3s. Great, let's go forward to the next question. All right, here it's related to the model and its assessment of the cost effectiveness. So 1 is that uncertainty in that model or overly favorable model assumptions create significant risk that the base case cost effectiveness estimates are too optimistic. So you can basically think of that as the too optimistic bucket. Number 3 is uncertainty or overly unfavorable model assumptions create a significant risk that the base case is too pessimistic. So this gets back to the assumptions that you heard from Greg around a variety of different attributes of the communities and the effectiveness of the intervention. So I'm not going to have him try to walk through all those again, but let's go back again to let people discuss whether they feel in particular. If you feel like the base case made good assumptions, you're comfortable with some of the assumptions or most of the assumptions, you would vote a 2 on this. If you think for some reason that it was overly pessimistic or optimistic, that's meant to be captured in this voting question. Does anybody feel like they are going to vote too optimistic or too pessimistic and would like to try to convince others to vote with them? All right. Brian.
I'll play devil's advocate a little bit. I'm leaning towards voting 1 just because we don't have hard data and a lot of the data is old. So I think it's possible that the modeling is being a bit overly optimistic about how much money would be saved. I presume the same argument could be used to say 3 too pessimistic, but I worry that the framing of all the findings today are leaning, and frankly, I think the SIFs sound like a very good idea, so I'm not trying to be negative here, but playing devil's advocate, I just think everything's kind of leaning towards the benefit, and I worry that there may be some overly optimistic assumptions being made.
Okay. Anybody else want to either react or have another comment? If not, we can move to the vote. Claudia, were you?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, there it is. I see it now on the side too. Claudia and then Steve.
Yeah, I just want to mention that I think that I'm leaning towards voting for 3, basically because we are dealing with an older study. I am influenced by the fact that the environment for people who use drugs has changed since due to various societal changes. People who use drugs have had to go to fentanyl, which we know raises the mortality rate. And so that I think the figures might actually be too pessimistic and that the rate has gone up astronomically over the past few years.
Okay, you've heard arguments in a sense that there is uncertainty and it could go in either direction. I think we've probably heard the discussions, but Steve had raised his hand. So Steve, anything you'd like to add?
Just another argument for 3, being that the Vancouver program is, a pretty advanced model that probably could be streamlined a bit to deliver the services without the, additional services that are provided in Vancouver.
Okay. Great. Let's go ahead and take our votes. Oh, Greg, I'm sorry. Greg, do you want to jump in real quick? Greg Lowe, do you want to jump in real quick? If not, we can go ahead and vote.
Oh, sorry, I was still muted. I just wanted to ask if the fact that it seems like we pushed a lot of naloxone out to first responders, so it's more likely someone on the scene earlier would have an intervention. Does that balance out the move to fentanyl? I don't know. I just, it's probably region by region and highly variable, but I wonder if that balances the fentanyl consideration.
I think given our time, I'm going to take that as something that people should definitely think about. And I'm pretty sure that there's not going to be any data to help suggest how that would or wouldn't balance out the fentanyl effect. But it's certainly something that people could consider. All right, let's go ahead.
Are on the front line. They're the first responders. So I think it's really important that they have it more so than even some of the other people that are allowed to carry it.
All right, thank you. Okay, folks, why don't you go ahead and finish your votes on this one then. Too optimistic is a 1, too pessimistic is a 3, neutral is a 2. All right, let's see the results. Okay. Fairly bell-shaped curve. Thank you. Let's go to the next question. All right, this one says as a 1 that it will not significantly reduce the negative impact of this condition on family and caregivers versus the comparator. Number 3 is that it will significantly reduce the negative impact of the condition on family and caregivers versus the comparator. Now, this language is borrowed from our usual reports on specific diseases and treatments for them. So you can kind of use this language loosely to question whether, again, a SIF or SIFs in general, through their impact, would also have a strong, significant impact on the family and caregivers versus an SSP. So let's go back so we can see each other and see if anybody has any thoughts on that. Maybe just real quickly ask one of the clinical experts or community experts, when you think about the impact that SIFs have outside of the individual user, is it in some way demonstrably different than what happened with an SSP? All right. Go ahead, Alexis. Sorry. Yes.
I'd be happy to take that. I mean,
sure. Go ahead, Alexis.
Most SSPs, at least here in the United States, don't allow sanctioned drug use inside the building, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's not part and parcel.
Can you speak up?
Sorry, Alexis, why don't you start over? It was just a tiny bit hard to hear you at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, on-site use of drugs within certain services programs, at least in the United States, is not sanctioned. So the idea that there would be a decrease in public drug use associated with an SSP, that's not a reasonable expectation. That's not the service that they provide. That is the specific purpose of an overdose prevention site. So as people come inside to use drugs, not only is there that benefit to the individual, right, but we've seen decreases in drug-related, litter, disorder, and public drug use. So all of those, I would argue, are both is a community benefit.
All right. Well, I like the way that the language specifically said caregivers, and I like the way that you instinctively think of society and the community as caregivers. I think that's a good thing. So I'll allow the CPAC to certainly consider how broadly they'd like to interpret that question in that way. Peter, are you raising your hand? Yes.
Public drug use definitely will go down. People are welcomed into SIS, SIFs or SIS is here in Canada,
Mhm.
and certainly the health benefits are bountiful. And if these are welcoming places, then people are going to come, and they're going to be welcomed, and there's going to be no less drug use in local business washrooms or in alleyways or in parks. Yeah, okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. I mean, do you think, or I mean, I know we're talking about places where there's no real evidence, but from what you're saying, it would suggest that people would use drugs less often at home, where it might affect the family, where the family has to be responsible for worrying about overdoses as opposed to a person going to a SIF. Is that possible?
Peter, can I hop in right quick? Because I think, I think it's really important now in COVID too, right? A lot of people are doing overdose prevention hotlines. So I'd call Peter up, give him my address, so they could call EMS services at the very least. But people want to go to these centers because people who use drugs have been structurally oppressed and removed from everything. And this is like their one place they have to be them, right? So they go to these places, to save their lives, but also to kind of have a community of practice and a community of care. And to Peter's point, if it's institutionalized and it's like Insight, people aren't going to use it as much unless if it's a community-based model formed by people who use drugs. And I'm not saying no doctors, no nurses or whatnot, but it has to be co-led and co-designed with them.
Okay, why don't we go back to the voting question then, and we will. All right. So again, number one would be it will not significantly reduce the negative impact of the condition on family and caregivers. Number three is it will significantly reduce the negative impact, with 2 being neutral. So please go ahead and vote. Almost there, one more. There we go, thanks. All right, so we've got 9 3s, 4 2s, and 2 1s. All right, let's go to the last of the specific potential other benefit contextual considerations. And this one says, number one is will not have a significant impact on improving return to work or overall productivity. And number three is that it will have a significant impact on improving return to work and or overall productivity. This is obviously linked to the idea of whether you think it does provide a magnitude of benefit over the comparator in the first place. And the question is, does that benefit spill out into factors of returning to work or their overall productivity? Number one or number three. So let's go back briefly to the whole group shot there. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about how they want to interpret this one on CPAC? Yes, Martha.
I keep being bothered by the word significant. So I think that
came up it came up in my last CPAC meeting.
Yeah, no, I mean I think I think there's an array of the way we're, or at least I imagine that we're thinking about significant, and I wonder if anybody wants to speak to that.
I mean, the only thing I will add to the conversation, which doesn't get at the use of the term significant, although I think I've heard Steve, not to put words in your mouth, say you can substitute the word substantial if that makes us all feel a little better on how we interpret that. But this return to work or worker productivity theme did not surface and was not an apparent theme, in the research that we did. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It's probably why it shows up here on the other potential benefits, because it was not something that we discovered. So I don't have much to offer to your deliberations on this particular topic.
If we want to see significant impacts, positive impacts, we need to acknowledge our privilege. Like if we look around here today, it's a lot of, white people. So we need to, like in Canada, Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted. We need to empower them to have employment. We need to educate them on safer drug use. We need to make huge structural changes, right? Is that going to happen overnight? No. But, like even overdose prevention sites and safe consumption sites, when you still have to go commit those crimes and that harm, why don't we just give people the drug, and then we'll start to see a significant impact in their lives. And we are already seeing a significant, like there's a couple papers out already.
Matt, I'm going to ask you to hang on to those ideas because I know you're as eager as we are to get to the policy roundtable, and we'll come up.
I'm going to put myself on mute and Kat lock it.
So, Steve,
just hold those good ideas. Just hold those good ideas because we want to talk about them. All right. Looks like Alexis and Kelly, and then we'll.
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, does it have to be a direct association, right? Because if you've shown that compared to an SSP, that a SIF does a better job of leading people to drug treatment, right? Mm-hmm. Which then it could be made the argument that if people are on treatment, then they may be more likely to become employed, right? Because they have a whole other host of things they don't have to work for. So if it doesn't have to be a direct benefit, but rather we can make that indirect connection, I think you could argue in favor of this.
Yes, right. Yeah.
The hard part about these votes, the hard part about these votes is often that we don't have direct evidence either. We have indirect evidence of an indirect effect or qualitative evidence, but it's a chance to at least recognize that if we think that decision makers who will ultimately be thinking about implementing SIFs, if we think that this should be a potential other benefit that they may want to consider in some way, then this is how we would indicate that. If we think that it's likely that it may have some significant impact, substantial impact.
But so Steve, there's no shame and there's no shame if it's uncertain that you just voted 2, right? Like, what's the guidance on? I mean, if it's okay, I was just curious. Like, I feel like we're all getting our feet under us around these mini Likert scales.
Yes, there's no shame in a 2. That's the bottom line in here. There's really no shame at all in a 2. Let me let Kelly comment and then we'll come back to the vote. Kelly?
So we gauged the health effects based on how many the mortality rate. So I think there's a significantly better chance of returning to work if you're still alive.
Yes.
So I'm gonna give it a 3. So
less people entering the prison system.
Yeah, there are ways that you could tell that. I like that very firm grasp of the obvious is what we used to call that. So thank you. All right, let's go back to the voting question. All right, so with the evidence on SIFs, please consider whether you think 1 or 2 or 3. All right, thank you. The results are, okay, we've got split vote again, but a fair number are both 3 and a few are number 1 as well. Okay, now we have just a couple minutes left on target for our agenda, so we're going to be a tiny bit over, but I can't imagine that we don't want to at least identify some other potential benefits or contextual considerations. Now we're going to have to do this differently than we might have done it in some other reports, because there's a long list of potential other benefits that have already been discussed. And people, and actually in Eric's presentation, it was, like low certainty, but a lot of these other potential other benefits. So let's just go back to so people can see each other. And I'm just gonna list the ones that I wrote down both from the report and from the discussion today. And then what I think would be helpful for the ultimate report here is maybe even not to take a vote on them, but to get a sense of the CPAC about which you would prioritize if we were going to rank them in some order in description for policymakers. Which do you think are the most important to put towards the top? Because they're all potential other benefits, and we're not going to run through them all. So 1, housing security. 2, increased enrollment or kind of beginnings of medication-assisted treatment. 3, decreased in infection rates with, kind of hepatitis or HIV. 4, decreasing the litter or the trash in the neighborhood. 5, decreasing public drug use. Now, there are a couple of concerns I'll mention as well, which you could actually say are potential disadvantages. But those are the main potential other benefits that I noted as we went through. There are 5 of them. So with this, the discussion I'd love to have is, are there others that you think are important enough to be part of this list that need to be highlighted further in the report? And among that, and/or among that 5, which do you think, what's number 1? What's your number 1 that you think decision makers should really be aware of?
Steve, could you put them in the chat box?
Yeah, let me try to do that if I can. Actually, let me just ask chat to do that. Cat to do that. Could I ask Kat to do that?
Yeah.
while I'm trying to keep my brain straight. So again, 1 is housing security. 2 is increase MAT. 3 is decrease infection with HIV or HCV. 4 is decrease litter trash. 5 is decrease public drug use. Now, all of these are already in the report, right? They're all there. So the question is, in this section of the report where we talk about potential other benefits, are there any that we want to highlight further?
Improve quality of life. I think that's like.
Well, yeah.
I guess that's overall, but I think if we don't state it, or employment opportunities, social connections, because I think things we hear the most for people going to these sites or on these programs, they get to see their families again, they get to work again, they get to do the things that everyone else gets to do. I don't know how you would word that, but.
Cool.
All right, well, no, I think we can capture certainly, it's kind of, some people would call it full participation in family and kind of society activities. This would increase their chance of being able to fully participate, whether it's work, family, all the other things that you mentioned. How does that fit?
Full participation in society and employment, or yeah.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay. It's okay if it overlaps with some of the previous votes we took too. All right, anybody want to have a special comment on this in terms of either, again, further items we should add to this list or how to prioritize within it? Brian?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think one of the key things in the United States is the political will to get this done. And unfortunately, we aren't as forward thinking as Canada and Europe and Australia. So I think if we're talking about making an argument for getting a SIF started somewhere, we need to make arguments that are going to win over the politicians. And that's number 4 and number 5, I think, really. Decreasing public drug use and decreasing the litter and trash is what's likely to win communities and votes that we're going to need to get SIFs going. So if you're saying, how should we prioritize these? If we're really looking to get these sites open, I would say those would be the 2 things we would prioritize as arguments in favor, not necessarily the most important thing to the people who would use the SIFs, but to getting the SIFs actually started.
Okay, thank you. Kelly?
Yeah, like my son is an EMT and an ambulance driver, and he has told me more than one time that 80 to 85% of the calls that he goes on are drug related, and a number of those are overdoses. So I have to think there's a reduction in the number of ambulance runs and medical costs if you reduce.
Yeah, we're going to get that one. We're going to capture in the very next voting question on cost.
Okay, and then as far as priorities, I'm thinking number 3, the decreasing the infection. So.
Okay. I know we wove that in to a certain extent in the clinical question, but I think it's fair to call it out also. I'm going to follow the line of raised hands since I was doing a bad job at that before. So it next should be Steve, then I'll go to Tara. Steve Kogut.
Thank you. Just an idea for another contextual consideration, the issue of bystander trauma.
Okay.
I would, that's an excellent one. I was just gonna put that in the chat box. It's come up in interviews, it's reported, you know, essentially, and it's specific, like the high school student who works at a fast food restaurant who discovers an overdose in the restaurant bathroom, right? That is a traumatic experience for that person. And that was cited by numerous people as kind of a compelling reason. You know, it may be captured in Steve's comment or number 5, decreasing public, you know, drug use, but that bystander trauma was heard multiple times over the last few months. So.
All right, Peter, I know you want to jump in too. Why don't you go ahead and jump in now, and then I'll follow up with the others.
This disrupts a lot of family life too. You know, children going into care, separation of parents, massive disruption of families.
Okay. Good. Thank you. I think Tara, you're next.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to bring up one thing we haven't talked a lot about is the impact. Well, it came up in context, the impact on the criminal justice system. So, you know, clearly these programs can, you know, decriminalize these individuals, and there's cost savings with that, you know, associated with you know, many things, but including, you know, overburdening the jail system. So I think there's a big impact there that we haven't discussed or taken the costs into account in this analysis.
I think in my memory of the discussion, that the evidence on the impact on crime is I wouldn't say it's mixed, but it's not very robust. Is that right, Eric?
It's true. That's when we think about crime as what's happening in the community. But maybe what Tara was referring to was something we did hear along the way, which is a recidivism issue, which is, you know, many people who would use a SIF would have a criminal record potentially of drug abuse, but or potentially of some other crime. And, you know, the SIF provides a safe place for those, protected environment for those people who use drugs to do that and potentially keep them, you know, there's no evidence supporting this, but I would say that we heard it along the way. I mean, I generally put it in the category of recidivism, but I don't know if that's the right, thematically, I'm not sure that that's what Tara meant, but that's kind of what I heard. So, but you're right, like there's no evidence that SIFs increase or decrease crime at a community level. The question is, a person who has a criminal record who is using a SIF, is it protective for a return to prison?
Right, that was what I meant. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if yeah, like I don't think we uncovered any research on recidivism, so I can't bring anything other than like stakeholders talked about the importance of this issue along the way.
And not all crime is drug related.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
All crime.
Right.
There's
Thank you. Yep.
studies that show crime doesn't go up or doesn't go down in an area where it is, but not to the direct individual. But the one I put in the post where like law enforcement sits outside of SCSs and SIFs actually leads to more harm and people don't enter.
Yeah, I think that was the point that I was going to add on. It's exactly what Matt said. I think this is very contextual. I think that police departments and police officers work in very different ways in different neighborhoods in different cities. And I think where you put the SIF and the partnerships that you form with local law enforcement is really going to be what drives what happens to crime in the area as a result.
Good. Now I'm going to unfortunately have to take the prerogative to move us forward. I think we've done a great job of fleshing some of these out, and we can take comments later about anything else that you think would merit highlighting in the report. But let's go ahead and go to the last question, the last voting question, which is the next one. Okay. So whereas we usually do a value vote here, this one, because we've already voted unanimously that it has a net health benefit, that we thought the more policy relevant question, again, for people who are listening and thinking about this at the legislative and other levels, is to ask whether it's cost saving. So is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that compared with SSPs, SIFs are cost saving? So Greg, do you want to just really briefly again, just summarize the findings? It is that there are cost savings, but just summarize the magnitude. And if there's a chart or a table that they should look at in the evidence summary, could you point that to them?
Sure. So there's tables 3.2, or wait, 3.1 through 3.3. Those are the different cities. And what we're seeing is that, yeah, a SIF is more expensive than an SSP alone for obvious reasons. It's got additional services offered. But the costs that you're saving through avoidance of ambulance rides and hospitalizations and all that, because the rates are so low in a SIF environment compared to an SSP, that's where the vast majority of the cost savings is coming in. And so that really overwhelms the incremental cost of one facility versus another.
Okay. CPAC, do you folks have any questions about the analysis before voting on whether you feel it is adequate to say that these are cost saving? All right, we've done a lot. Oh, Steve, did you have another question or comment?
Well, one thing that came to mind as I was reviewing the model was the decisions around the reach of the SSP programs. So, how broadly could the programs be sort of distributed to meet the needs of populations that were more widespread in a community than an SIF? And, I could just envision that you could sort of invest in an SSP and reach more people than an SIF could. And I imagine you had to make some sort of a decision about the scope of the SSP in the modeling. I hope that's clear.
I just want to comment that, the SSP function of a SIF is capable of having a broader reach than the SIF function of the SIF. So there's nothing, we did hear some discussion about whether some people who wouldn't want to use a SIF would feel stigma about going there to use it as an SSP, but there's nothing inherent about that model that would prevent a SIF from distributing supplies as an SSP to a broader group than the narrow area of people who are willing to walk there to use drugs.
Stephen, I think that the model is built off about 2,100. I'm kind of looking at Greg, but he can't tell I'm looking at him. People who use drugs being the client base of a SIF, right? So to your point, which is that if you live in a community that is rural or highly distributed, and the concentration of people who use drug is not such that you could serve that population, then the economic model may not work. You'll notice that the way that the economic team put it together is that they chose 6 different cities, and I think there was a lot of confidence that there were areas of concentrated drug activity or people who use drug in those municipalities or in those urban areas that the SIF model would work there, if that makes sense. But it does fall apart if you're like, I'm going to do this in Springfield, Illinois, which has an opioid use disorder problem, but doesn't have the density of drug use.
Yeah, and I just want to add that the emergency services reductions are among the clients of the SIF. And then, the SSP functions that are served by both comparators, we're assuming essentially, cancel each other out. And all that benefit is coming from that clientele that is at the SIF, and that reduction in emergency services among them.
All right. let's go back to the vote. Then, I'm sorry, Leftherios, I apologize. I didn't see your hand. Would you like to make a quick comment?
Just a quick question. Why the people who wrote the questions didn't decide to use a geographic locator or differentiator to make them more specific? It doesn't change my voting, but this was something that I was thinking all along. Or we can discuss it at the, the next session also.
Well, I think the unit, it's a good question because the unit of analysis, if you will, here is the city. I mean, we've basically taken the results and in the model, we've done it at the city level. I suppose you could say that would be true at the neighborhood level, but the numbers themselves come from extrapolation to the cities, right, Greg? Is that a fair way to? Yeah. So if that helps. Okay, let's go back to the voting question. And good, let's go ahead and vote then. So is the evidence adequate in your judgment to demonstrate compared with SSPs, SIFs are cost saving? A is yes, B is no. Okay. Waiting for one more. Everybody check just to see if your response is lit up. Oh, whoops, some people are trying again. All right. Is anybody struggling to get their vote in? Because it looks like we're stuck at 14. But why don't we go ahead and we will just address that 15th vote later. All right, let's see the results. Okay. Well, we took the snapshot when there were only 13 results. But I'm going to take it that this is a pretty clear result as it is. Okay, unanimous vote. Thank you very much. That was excellent, and it's all been a tee up for the policy roundtable. And first, I need to apologize a little bit to some of the roundtable participants who've probably been listening in for the 15 minutes or so now when they thought they would already be started on the policy roundtable. We're going to have a good amount of time for it, but we are going to take a 5-minute break. So if we can reconvene. Now it's 3:17. I tell you what, let's reconvene at 3:25. So that gives everybody 8 minutes. Oops, 7 minutes now. So if everybody can be back, am I doing the math right? Yeah, 3:25, please, because that way we'll be able to jump right into the policy roundtable. Thank you again for the votes and the discussion, and we'll pick up a lot of interesting threads when we get back at 3:25.